And the cruise ships, it was kind of confusing to look at the cruise shifts, because if there was, it said 3 cruise shifts, you reduced your call volume by X amount. Well, if I did a cruise shift that was 4 hours, and Eric did a cruise shift that was 24 hours, we both got credit for a cruise shift, and it made it kind of confusing, although that wasn't the intent, because each one of those were supposed to be worth 8 hours. So what we did is we got rid of all of that, we added cruise shift hours, and the map and put 96 hours. So what that means is that if you get 96 hours of cruise shift, in other words, you've told the department that you're going to be available regardless of where you're at, 96 hours in a quarter, you don't have to respond to any calls. And the idea of that, and the reason for that is if you're committing to the department that you're going to respond in 96 hours over that 3-month period, you're going to go on calls. And going on calls is kind of why we do what we do. We train so when we get on scene, we can be efficient.
So these red numbers are red?
Red or
is
new.
Another change?
This is the latest change.
So as late as January, we've made another change?
And all this is the requirement hasn't changed, it's just how we're presenting it, so it makes it cleaner. And actually what this allows somebody to do is, before we were showing 4 and 8, and those were kind of your benchmarks of what your cruise shifts were, but we have people that, I'm gonna be available for 2 hours, or I'm gonna be available for 6 hours. Something outside of that, so all we do is, at the end of the quarter, we count up all of their cruise shift hours, not number of cruise shift, their hours, divide it by 8, and that's how you get something between 0 and 96.
Was this method retroactively applied to everybody then, too?
This doesn't change what we've done before.
It hasn't changed.
No, it's just a different way of looking at it.
Okay, got it.
Go ahead. So, back to what we talked about. I presented 40, we agreed on 30, and we're at 20. As far as the training, hasn't changed. Although the first 2 that are in red were considered 7 drills, the idea was is get 2 hours of drill, so it was 14 hours, and then 14 hours on 2018 is when we went to hours and away from drills. Go ahead. So the question came up about, well, our requirements are stringent, more stringent than our neighbors and other departments in the area. So I asked Eric to do a survey. This was done in January. You can't read it, but I broke it down for the top ones. Go ahead and go to the next one, please. So looking at training, ours is 14 hours. Dexter is 18 hours. Lowell and South Plain both have 12, but in their requirement back on that sheet, they had a low and a high, and I'm not sure why they did that. So what I represented at the 12 was the low end of their requirements. So for these agencies, this is the training requirements per quarter for each agency.
And where is that? Where are we on that?
We are
For
the first one. We're the first one. Oh. Never mind. Go ahead.
These are also, excluding South Lane, these are non-transport agencies that don't have.
Say again, Chrissy.
They're non-transport agencies. So for instance, Oakridge's members have the time on transport to have that training and time with the patient, whereas some of these other departments do not have that because they don't have any.
But we don't count that, right?
He doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
The back to like LFA, those that do transport, their requirements are a little different in that it's like 60 hours, or 60% of the calls or drills, or 75% of the drills. I think Lane Fire Authority, I think is the one that it's 40 hours per year. And if you, I'm going off the top of my head, I'll give you wrong.
Dan Barkley,
Looking,
you want to say something?
go ahead.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
just real quick, the areas that you're comparing it to, a couple of points, and I'm not sure about South Lane, but you're talking places that are half the distance to a major medical facility than Oakridge is, and our numbers compare, but I'm kind of curious, we have a town of 3,200 people. What's the population of these other And Dexter is more rural than urban than we are, but, and Lowell, I think, is a touch over 1,000, so their population's a little bit less. But Goshen, Pleasant Hill, South Lane, Dexter, what's the population of those areas that are half the distance from Riverbend that we are? As
I
far,
don't
as far
know,
as
I don't know the
transit.
population off the top of my head.
Well, and I guess what I'm
So,
saying,
but you're
comparing the
building-
training hours, if you've got much more populated areas with something half the distance, you're not really talking apples to apples comparing our training hours to anybody else, and
And
we
you're
don't
actually
live
building-
anybody else if we're talking about the safety of Oakridge citizens.
And you're actually building the case for more training hours. Because what you just said is we're further away, so our people need to be better than these other agencies.
Well, they're getting training.
But that's a philosophy thing.
Steve?
Actually, what you just said was great. I like the fact that you said that between 4 and 8, that Scott can train the people on his shift, because that should apply to that. Because every time they transport on an ambulance, and Scott's in that ambulance training 2 people, a driver and a EMT, that EMT and that driver should get the training to and from Eugene for the entire trip, because they're training with the training officer. Just like OJT for a police officer, when that police officer works with another FTO, that training, all those training hours for that police officer all count.
So that's
Through
what Steve
DPSSD,
like
they
to
all
see.
count through DPSSD, and as a
Okay.
former training officer for the police department, I know that to be the case.
Thank you,
Thank
Steve.
you.
You had your, did you wanna say something?
I do.
Go ahead.
I'm a citizen of Oakridge. I'm looking at the clock. I feel as though I'm in a 1-day training course for firefighters and EMS. All you're doing is justifying why you're here. Please tell me where your plan's gone wrong. I haven't got all night. Sorry.
Just go on. I don't think the plan is wrong.
Oh, well,
been adjusted
you got
how
a
many
problem.
times?
It's failing.
It's failing big time.
I appreciate that statement. Let's move forward.
Back to training, we're in line with everybody else, regardless of our philosophy in whether we need to train more, train less, or how we're getting the training. And those are things that, as we grow and we go in the future, maybe that's something that we look at where we control. Training is, Scott, when you're doing the training class, what are the things you need to do? You've got requirements. I mean, you've got expectations. We're gonna train and we're gonna cover these topics. So, because it's controlled, and we, as an organization, we need to make sure that we cover those kinds of things. I'm not saying our training's perfect by any means,
And not all of it happens in a classroom.
and it absolutely doesn't, and I agree.
You know, that driver and EMT on the road, and I'll tell you what, Justin Mock he can put an IV in a moving ambulance and you never feel it. Not, Renee was the best ever
Okay,
till
let's
then.
continue.
But not all training happens in the classroom. And
Totally,
I see
I agree with
the 14
that.
hours of classroom time, but no credit for when they're actually getting the practical experience.
And that goes
on
back to
call.
the 20 responses
Dan.
that could get it from there.
Thank you, Dan. Let's continue.
Let's go ahead and go on. Looking at the requirements for calls, which kind of goes in line if we're running on 20 calls, and whether it's getting counted on the 14 or getting counted elsewhere, it's expertise or it's learning as you do that. So back to the same ones that we looked at, we have 20. Goshen has, basically it's 10% of their call volume. Looking at their call volume for last year, it worked out to 12. The other 3 that have 0 call volume here, you think, oh wow, why is that? They've got other requirements that we don't have as volunteers, that kind of back when we were saying, if you're doing 96 hours of cruise ship, you're gonna go on calls. They do it somewhere a little differently. Go ahead and go to the next one. Next one. There you go. They have additional volunteer requirements, and they require their volunteers to be on shift in the station. We don't do that. Dexter, it's 48 hours per month for outside volunteers, and they're encouraging 48 hours per month for their in-district volunteers, and they are looking at making that as part of their standard. Lowell is 1 24-hour shift per week as a volunteer. Goshen is 4 12 hours, and South Lane is 1 12-hour shift per month. So they have additional requirements that the individual actually, they have to be in the station to be part of the member. Kind of back to what you were saying, Steve, in mandating or requiring, they're requiring you to actually be there. And I don't know that any of these are stipend supported. I don't know that question. So, yeah, let's talk quickly about alarms and kind of how this has impacted go ahead. Next one. So, for the last 3 years, this is our call volume. Not sure why the big jump from 16 to 17. I suspect that it has to do with our data that changed and the way we are actually capturing our information. Go ahead. But for the 6-month period that we were talking about here, we responded to 487 alarms in that 6-month period. 340 of them were EMS, just to give you an idea of the breakdown. 113 were public assist, and we need to work on that because there's a little more in that other than what it's just called public assist, and 34 were fire. We averaged 2.5 alarms per day. We had 54 times where we had 2 calls going on at the very same time, and we had 4 times where we had 3 alarms going on at the same time in this 6-month period. And we had 0 times where we were not able to respond and cover the calls. Now, I'm not saying that if it was a structure fire or something like that, we didn't have help or assistance or motor vehicle accidents, but we were able to respond. Looking at the 34 EMS calls, back to what you guys have been talking about as far as training, 235 of those are transport, and and we average about 1.2 transports a day. That's 3 hours of round trip, just like what Kristen was talking about. That's a lot of time in that box. Can we do a better job at capturing that and utilizing that time? Absolutely. Currently, it's not part of our program. That doesn't mean that we can't. So, looking at the white elephant in the room, the 5 that are no longer members versus the volunteers, the rest of, I'll call them active volunteers. So we're looking at that same period of the 487, the active or the rest of the volunteers responded to 332 calls, the 5 that we're talking about in that 6-month period responded to 84, and we had 56 or 12% of the calls where we had no volunteer respond.
Wait, can you write that slide? You have a number next to 5 dismissed. Why is there not a number next to how many active volunteers you have?
That's the next slide. So, thank you, Kurt. So, currently, we have 5 paid personnel. We have a fire chief, we have a designated training officer, which was one of the things that was brought up in the SWOT analysis, if you remember. We have 3 lieutenants, 1 on each shift. We have 11 active members, and we have 3 new recruits at the point. And we have 2 members that are on leave of absence, that are not part of that. And then one of the things that improved the safety to our community, and it has helped us in our response and our delivery system, is adding the 5 part-time positions. A lot of the things that we've been talking about are individuals and some training, but what you can have is single role volunteers, which we have a lot of those. So you could have the paid person back in the day before we went to this. You have a paid person, and all of our paid people are dual role, which means they're EMS trained. Actually, they're all paramedics, and very good paramedics, by the way, because of where we live. It forces them to be. And they're also fire trained. But they could be working with somebody that's strictly EMS. And so when you're going on a fire, they gotta wait until they get other fire personnel to come and help. We don't have that situation today because all of our part-timers are dual role. And that's all I was wanting to say on that. I'm gonna keep moving, then we can.
You wanna keep moving just one more slide?
We are about there.
You're almost there,
There's
okay.
over 2 slides. And I just talked about that. So because of our increase in our part-time, that's allowed us to have dual role personnel. It has also helped us having the ability to run 2 calls, EMS calls at the same time, or it could be fire calls. And then having the training officer on that's designated Monday through Friday has allowed us to expand the opportunity, not only for our volunteer training, but also for our paid staff training. Because one of the weak points that we had before in our paid staff training, they were always the instructor. This gives an opportunity for them to learn and expand their knowledge as well. And so to answer the question, Oakridge citizens are just as safe as they were prior to the 5 being dismissed.
On the one slide, it said 11 active volunteers. Are the 5 people that got dismissed?
They're not part of
those
that.
11?
No, they're not part of that.
So
This
they
is,
could work like 500 hours in a quarter and not be considered an active member, active volunteer?
500 hours in.
Yep.
That's what we worked last quarter.
If they showed up for calls and drills and participated in the fire department, they would be
Ben?
considered
Wait,
an
wait.
active volunteer.
Thank you, I'll answer.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
But thank you.
Right.
Um,
And then,
That goes back to utilizing your time when you're at the station, and I don't want to get into individual scenarios.
So I actually am not quite understanding what the question was and what the answer was.
So the question was, we have listed 11
11
active volunteers.
plus 3 new recruits.
And I asked, are the 5 people that were
In that
dismissed
11?
considered in the 11? And he said, no.
Right.
And I said, well, if they could put in 500 hours in a quarter of volunteering time, how come they're not considered an active member?
I just want to
And
ask
he's
one.
about to answer it.
Again, this is an emotional deal, and I understand people have,
It's
not emotional.
Because you're
Okay.
not vested here, you don't live here, he doesn't live here, he
Chrissy?
doesn't live
Chrissy?
here, he doesn't live here, I live here. This
so the
affects my
question would
family.
be, I could turn that question around. If they're spending 500 hours in a
Thank
quarter
you, Jeff.
here, why couldn't they, volunteer, why couldn't they get 14 hours of training?
They
I mean,
did get
so-
14 hours of training.
Because they
Riding
get
with
training
him
from
in an ambulance.
Wisconsin. That's why.
That should count.
Wait a minute. Thank you.
No, it's not about, my question isn't about whether or not they're trained. My question is.
It should be if they
How
respond.
could a person work 500 hours and not be considered an active volunteer? That seems strange to me. That's pretty active.
Okay, I assume we're talking about Paul and Melissa. The hours that they work are on a stipend. So they're
Not
there.
all of them.
Wait,
Okay,
please. Let him answer.
So, okay, majority of their, Paul has it for a while, but, when you're working on a stipend, you're committed to the department. The idea is that you're there from 4 to 8 at the station, and, for the 24-hour period, any call that we go on, you're to respond. And for that, the department gives you a stipend of $100. So that's the catalyst of what brings them there.
what, it's
Or,
what?
you know, let me.
Oh,
Wait
so
a
we
minute,
only do it
wait
for the
a
money
minute.
now?
Okay.
That's very
Please,
Talk
insulting.
about the stipend program.
You
Really,
need to
Ben?
shut
Hey.
up.
That's enough.
Seriously?
That is
He
enough.
needs to be
This is
respected.
exactly
Chrissy,
why there's a
that's
split
enough.
in the
That's
department.
enough.
Hear what he said?
I will ask that you all leave if you
Good.
can't keep your tempers in control. If this is too personal, then you should leave now.
That was highly insulting, Mayor.
Thank you.
Can I say something? Yes, please. When I look at the budget, now, how many years you been here?
Here,
Yes.
this is
3.5.
3.5.
Okay, have you saved us any money in this fire department since you've been here? Because I look at it very much as the finances of our town, of this community that pays for this. And when I look at our problem with our finance, every year, for the $1 million that we put out to the fire department and the EMT every year, since you've been here, have you showed us any savings in what you're doing?
This isn't a budget class, but I'd say yes, we have, and I could sit down and show you in the budget where we've done. some
Well,
different
I'm on
things.
that budget committee, and I'm very much, I looked at it today again, and I looked at the audit. And I understand all this, just like I see what you put.
Tonight, we're talking about
the
requirements.
Exactly. And I look at Leo Robb, right here. Leo puts in 72 Leo Robb puts in 72 calls, correct?
I'm
Okay,
not looking at the report.
he's,
We're good.
well, that's what you put. So, this individual, he seems to be really worked. Maybe some of his time can go to one of these other people over there. Would that be fair?
No.
It doesn't.
Shh, why?
Okay,
Right.
let's not talk,
Please.
we're not here to talk
Please.
about the budget, although, Mr. Hadley, I appreciate that, because it is important that we remember the numbers. Right now, we're here to talk about, whether or not we are having the adequate coverage that we have. I am not unaware of the fact that this is very personal, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but this is not the venue to air individual and personal grievances. I want to get to the bottom of this and understand, as a counselor and as mayor, I want us all to understand how this works. This is not easy to understand. You all live and breathe this. I do not. So I would ask some consideration for us to be able to ask questions. Chrissy, you have a lot of knowledge, and I expect you to help the council understand this, and you have been doing that. So let's continue on with asking good questions. And for me, my question is as much as I understand the process in any organization of if you have a standard that you have agreed to, and members don't meet that standard, then they shouldn't be part of the organization. I get that. That is absolutely fair and justifiable. However, what I don't quite understand is if you have a standard that is consistently being changed and revised in order to accommodate because it isn't quite working and you're massaging it, that makes it even more difficult, I think, to hold your members to that standard because it's fluid. That concerns me. It doesn't have anything to do with the individuals, the names attached, or how well trained or not trained they are. It's just that I want to see it held to an even standard. It's difficult, community, because we as counselors cannot tell the fire chief how to run his department. I cannot tell the city administrator how to administer his department heads. We can express our concern and say, we don't like what's going on, or we really like what's going on, or we think everything's fine. So please understand that as we sit here and talk about this. Counselors, do you have questions? Bobby?
That is something I've been thinking about for a while, so it's not related to all the recent conversations. For volunteers, can they go to outside trainings that are outside of our fire department and
Can they
receive credit
go?
for those? Yeah, can they go to them and receive credit, or are we?
They can now. That's new. That goes back to that 14-hour change.
So like for me, like when I was a state employee, for DOJ, they would have, like DHS would offer trainings in a variety of things. So I could go to their trainings and get some of my minimum requirements for my job from one of their trainings. So is that something similar that can happen
Yes, now.
for staff here? So
And that's one of the adjustments that we've made as we grow in this process. As a community, I would think that you would be concerned with a group that's not trained, or are trained at a minimum level.
Yeah.
I don't mean
Kind
not
of a-
trained, but.
It's kind of a iffy statement. Chrissy?
Actually, in my past experience with Oakridge was great with outside training. They would pay for our classes. We could go get whatever class we want, pretty within some financial cost reason. But since Mr. Hansen has been here, people are denied $25 classes, $40 classes, and I can't have those people come up here and speak to you.
You don't have to.
That you have denied them. Eric has denied them. I'm talking nominal numbers. They are denied to go take those trainings.
Counselors, any questions? Paul? Do you have any questions? Dan, do you have any questions? Okay, and I saw hands up there, so. Looking for people who haven't said anything, but okay. That's okay, that's fine, go ahead.
Okay, so I know you don't wanna hear our emotional responses, but
Okay.
the 3 volunteers sitting in that row right there all get paychecks from the fire department as well. So pointing us out that we are motivated by money is highly insulting to me.
I apologize.
Because that is not
That's
why I
not-
do this.
I apologize.
$4
That's
an hour,
not
it's
intent
not.
or whatever.
But, after that being said, can you go back to the pie chart, please? So those responses are, the blue is including 11 volunteers, not including the 5 of us that were dismissed,
That's not
correct?
including the 5 of you.
So the 5 of us responded to 18%, and the 11 responded to 70. And several of us 5 have 40, 50, 60-hour a week jobs as well. So I don't think that's a fair assessment, personally.
That's the data of what we.
Right, but you can skew data to say what you want it to say and make it look a certain way.
Just because my question, my actual
it's about
response
the
goes
pie
to
chart.
this pie chart. I, for one, as an Oakridge resident, prefer my firefighters, citizen volunteers, to live in the city, to be trained by our firemen, and I feel 18% less safer today than I felt the day when they were working.
Thank you for that comment, Chrissy.
Well, when you were talking about how our standards have stayed the same, but his plan has kind of evolved all the way until January of this year, I want to know, maybe Chrissy could answer this because I trust you more. How hard would it actually be to go back to, if somebody really has got 500 hours in a quarter, how hard would that be for him to track to give them credit for that now? Since we know they actually did go on calls, there's got to be some way to actually show that they put in those actual hours.
So from running calls,
Yeah.
we can pull a report on the PCR program.
And so it would be easy to give them credit now.
15 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead. I just have a question as to, you keep talking about quality versus quantity and training and all of that. What's, of the volunteers you have in your row that you brought, what is their highest level of certification compared to those that were dismissed? An EMR? And you dismissed an intermediate and a basic?
It is a big deal. It's a very big deal. It's a life-saving big deal.
Well,
We're getting.
Who do it for a living?
I would like to know on this body that's here, how many of these volunteers and how long they've lived here?
I've been here 3 years, I work over 60 hours a week, and I train more than all 5 of these people put together.
Not always. You don't always work
We
here.
don't wanna get in discussion about
I'm
what
just
you did
saying,
or
it's
what you
not
know.
that hard.
I went on last
It's
year.
not that
You don't
hard.
have children.
Right, do you have kids or a family? It does matter.
Don't get into this.
Audience.
I did 14 hours in 3 months.
Don't
Audience.
dispute with me.
You
Counselor.
should be ashamed of running.
Out. Mr. Ball?
Yes, sir. Yes, no.
I've been here 38 years.
I know.
Paul?
We've been here for 10 years. I also have a question.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Has the city lowered its standards on what they want for a fire chief? Because in the past, we've always had a paramedic fire chief that's also fire. And now we have a temporary that has been here for 3.5 years, that's an EMR. That's the same rank as I am, and all the lowest ones are people he didn't fire.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your question, and, you know, there is going to be a time when we are going to have to hire a fire chief, and that is coming. And those are all things that need to be considered, but can I answer that specifically? I really can't. But it's a good point.
I've been here 30 years.
Thank you. Go ahead.
May I just read my
Yes, of course, you may.
I try to get along with everybody, and I tend to just watch and try to.
You're on the fire department.
I'm an advanced EMT. The city paid for my training.
Okay.
Also
I-
a school teacher.
I'm a milk and word teacher, and softball coach, and other things. I'm involved in the community. right
Thank
there.
you.
And it hurts me to see the department split up like it is, and I just would like to read this. Oakridge City Council. I came to Oakridge in 1992 and began volunteering with the Oakridge Fire Department and EMS in 1993. I have been invested in this community and want what's best for it. The past year was my 25th year with the department, and instead of receiving a letter of "thank you for your service to our community" type of letter, all I have received are 2 letters of "you're not doing a good enough job" and are about to be terminated. I got my first letter when they sent out all the letters. I had gone to Alaska to see my grandson. The next quarter, Jeff said, you're doing great, you exceeded it. And then this last quarter, I didn't, have enough, and so I got another letter, but I did go in and meet with Hanson. Instead of a thank you for your community service, I received 2 letters.